Oh, good morning. My name's Jackie Mawson. Once a detective, always. And I'm looking at some of the worst crimes ever committed in the UK.
The Midlands, 1990s, cold industrial estates, neon-lit laybys, and the lonely stretches of tarmac where truckers and sex workers crossed paths. In the early hours, the glow of sodium streetlights caught the shimmer of rain on cracked pavement. It was there that police officers discovered the body of 23-year-old Sammy-Jo Bell, a sex worker whose short life had ended with brutal violence. Months later, another woman, 25-year-old Tracey Turner, was found in eerily similar circumstances, her life extinguished with the same terrifying precision. These were not random tragedies. They bore the dark signature of a predator who hunted on the margins of society, targeting women who were often ignored or dismissed. The tabloids dubbed him the Midlands Ripper, a chilling echo of the infamous Yorkshire Ripper, who had haunted northern England just a decade before. The killer wasn't a shadowy phantom, but a man hiding in plain sight. A long-haul lorry driver named Alun Kyte. He crisscrossed the country's highways by day and stalked vulnerable women by night. At first, the police were confounded. Two bodies, linked by profession and geography, but with little forensic evidence to tie them to a suspect. Rumors spread like wildfire. Was this another serial killer stalking Britain's motorways? Fear rippled through communities, particularly among women working the streets. The story of Alun Kyte is one of grim persistence, of a man who thought he could move unseen in the spaces between cities, exploiting those society too often disregards. But it's also the story of forensic science catching up to him, and of DNA evidence, a breakthrough tool in the 1990s, becoming the thread that finally unraveled his lies. This is the story of Alun Kyte, the Midlands Ripper. The killings of Sammy-Jo Bell and Tracey Turner shook the Midlands in the mid-1990s. Both women were young, vulnerable, and earning their living as sex workers in Birmingham and Nottingham. They were found murdered months apart, their bodies dumped in isolated locations along the arterial routes of central England. The brutality of their deaths, coupled with the similarities in their circumstances, pointed to a single perpetrator, a serial predator haunting the motorways. Alun Kyte was not a name that meant anything to the public at the time. To most who encountered him, he was just another truck driver moving goods across Britain's industrial heartlands. But beneath this ordinary exterior lurked a pattern of violence that would later be revealed. Kyte exploited his mobility, using the anonymity of the road to cover his tracks. He targeted women who were marginalized, believing they would not be missed, or if they were, their cases would not receive the same attention as others. The investigation into the murders initially faltered, with few witnesses and scant forensic material. The police struggled to build momentum. Communities in Birmingham and Nottingham grew increasingly uneasy, and comparisons to the Yorkshire Ripper's reign of terror a decade earlier heightened public fear. The idea of another lorry-driving killer prowling the night was almost too dreadful to confront, yet impossible to ignore. The breakthrough came not through traditional detective work, but through science. DNA profiling, still a relatively new tool in the 1990s, emerged as the decisive factor. Biological traces linked both killings to the same man. Over time, those traces would point unerringly to Kyte. In 1997, he was arrested for other offenses, and the DNA samples taken would later connect him to the murders of Sammy-Jo Bell and Tracey Turner. By 2000, Alun Kyte stood trial. The evidence was damning, and the facade of an ordinary truck driver crumbled in his court. He was convicted of both murders and sentenced to life imprisonment. To this day, investigators suspect that Kyte may have been responsible for other unsolved killings along Britain's motorways. The Midlands Ripper was behind bars, but the questions his crimes raised linger still. To understand the crimes of Alun Kyte, we need to step back into his early years, into the landscape of Britain that shaped him, and into the ordinary facade behind which he concealed his darkest impulses. Alun Kyte was born in the 1960s in Staffordshire, a region of the English Midlands defined by industrial towns, sprawling motorways, and working-class communities. He grew up in an unremarkable family environment, the kind that produced men who found steady work in trades, factories, or the haulage industry. Neighbors later recalled him as quiet, even polite, with nothing outwardly to distinguish him from countless other young men of his generation. Yet beneath that veneer was a restlessness, a man without strong roots, drifting from job to job, relationship to relationship. By the early 1990s, Kyte had established himself as a lorry driver. The role gave him both livelihood and cover. He could travel vast distances with little oversight. His presence in any town or city easily explained by the demands of the job. The endless ribbons of asphalt that tied Britain together became his hunting ground. Long nights behind the wheel, punctuated by stops and laybys, industrial estates, and red light districts, created opportunities for encounters, some casual, others fatally predatory. The women he targeted, Sammy-Jo Bell and Tracey Turner, lived lives on society's margins. Sammy-Jo, only 23, was known for her quick wit and her resilience. Friends said she was trying to pull herself out of the life of prostitution, but poverty and addiction had drawn her back to the streets of Birmingham. Tracey Turner, 2 years older, came from Nottingham. She was described as trusting, sometimes naive, but fiercely devoted to her young child. Both women were caught in cycles of hardship that made them easy prey for someone like Kyte, a man who offered money, transport, and apparent kindness before revealing his capacity for cruelty. To police investigators, these victims were tragically familiar archetypes. The 1990s in Britain saw many cases where sex workers were attacked, and too often their cases were sidelined. This neglect is precisely what killers like Kyte counted on. The public rarely knew their names until it was too late, and their disappearances were not treated with the same urgency as others. Kyte thrived in this blind spot. He was not part of an organized gang, nor a flamboyant criminal kingpin. Instead, he was the more chilling figure, the invisible predator who blended in, a face you would not remember after passing at a service station. Unlike gangsters who commanded fear, Kyte relied on being overlooked. His ordinariness was his camouflage. By the time police pieced together who he was, Kyte had already inflicted irreversible damage. 2 young lives were gone, families were shattered, and entire communities had been left with a haunting sense that danger could come not from the shadows, but from the everyday figures we hardly notice. Alun Kyte, the Midlands Ripper, was never destined for infamy in the way of gangland bosses, but in his anonymity lay the essence of his menace. Unlike the sprawling networks of organized crime or the headline-grabbing exploits of gangland bosses, Alun Kyte's operations were deeply personal and terrifyingly simple. His arena of crime was not a boardroom or a pub backroom, but the lonely motorways that cut across the Midlands and beyond. A lorry driver by trade, Kyte turned his job into the perfect disguise for predation. He had reason to be everywhere, and that mobility allowed him to hide in plain sight. He was known to frequent red light districts in Birmingham, Nottingham, and along the major service areas of the M1 and M6. These were not places of glamour, but rain-soaked pavements, neon-lit corners, and the quiet desperation of sex work in the 1990s. Kyte's modus operandi was chilling in its predictability. He would approach women under the pretense of paying for sex, coax them into his vehicle, and then drive them to isolated spots where his violence unfolded. The brutality of his attacks suggested both control and rage. Victims were strangled or beaten, their bodies left discarded in out-of-the-way locations, wooded laybys, wastelands, or roadside verges. For investigators, this pointed to someone who knew the geography intimately, someone who was used to the back roads and industrial dead ends that lay just beyond the main highways. A lorry driver, constantly on the move, fit the profile with uncanny precision. Kyte's ability to evade detection was enhanced by society's indifference to his chosen victims. Sex workers, often struggling with poverty or addiction, were easy to overlook. Their disappearances were rarely met with the urgency afforded to others, and Kyte knew this. Each attack emboldened him. He learned to take risks, confident that his life of transience insulated him from scrutiny. One day he could be in Birmingham, the next in Leeds, and by the weekend back in Nottingham. To police forces working within tight geographical jurisdictions, he was a ghost who slipped between boundaries. There were also signs that Kyte's violence extended beyond the 2 confirmed murders. Several unsolved cases from the era, women found along motorway corridors. Victims with similar patterns of assault have been revisited with his name in mind, while only 2 killings have been definitively tied to him. Investigators suspect there may be more. The scale of his violence remains an open question, one that casts a long shadow over Britain's unsolved cases from that decade. What made Kyte so dangerous was not just his violence, but his invisibility. He was not the kind of predator who boasted or courted fear. Instead, he lived the life of an everyman: fuel stops, delivery depots, motorway cafes. He was the man in the next booth eating a fry-up, or the driver parked in the adjacent bay. No one would have suspected that behind that ordinariness was a man the press would one day call the Midlands Ripper. His operations were not grandiose, but they were devastating, and they were about to collide with the relentless persistence of science and the slow but steady determination of British policing. When the bodies of Sammy-Jo Bell and Tracey Turner were discovered, the West Midlands and Nottinghamshire police forces were thrust into investigations already hampered by limited evidence. Both women worked on the fringes of society, and for detectives, that reality brought additional obstacles, fewer witnesses willing to come forward, communities reluctant to talk, and the haunting knowledge that similar cases had often languished unresolved. From the outset, investigators suspected a serial offender. The geography of the crimes, the Midlands motorways, the hidden verges, the isolated industrial estates suggested someone with both knowledge of the terrain and reason to travel it frequently, but with no clear suspect. The case risked stalling, witness statements were inconsistent, and the lack of CCTV coverage in the 1990s meant no visual trail. Forensic science was still in its adolescence, and while DNA profiling had been pioneered in Britain, it was far from the powerful database-driven tool it would later become. Police task forces pored over vehicle logs, questioned known offenders in the sex trade districts, and even considered copycat killers inspired by the Yorkshire Ripper. Hours of manpower yielded little. The pressure mounted as media coverage intensified. Headlines about a Midlands Ripper sparked fear and anger, particularly among families of sex workers who felt their daughters were being ignored until they turned up dead. The breakthrough came not from immediate detective work, but from patience. By 1997, Kyte had been arrested in connection with unrelated violent offenses against women. As procedure dictated, DNA samples were taken and entered into the growing national database. When those samples were cross-referenced with forensic evidence recovered from the bodies of Sammy-Jo Bell and Tracey Turner, the match was undeniable. After years of hunting a phantom, police finally had a name. Detectives who had been chasing shadows now found themselves staring at a suspect who looked disarmingly ordinary. A truck driver with no outward signs of menace. The discovery underscored the chilling truth that the predator they sought had been blending into everyday life all along. From that moment, the investigation shifted from speculation to pursuit. Alun Kyte was no longer invisible, and the walls of law enforcement began to close around him. For years, the murders of Sammy-Jo Bell and Tracey Turner lingered in the unsolved files, haunting detectives who knew a serial predator was at large but could not yet put a name to him. The turning point arrived in the late 1990s, and it came through a revolution in forensic science. In 1997, Alun Kyte was arrested in connection with violent assaults against two other sex workers. These were non-fatal attacks, but the brutality mirrored the savagery that had ended Sammy-Jo and Tracey's lives. As part of standard procedure, a DNA sample was taken from Kyte and added to the national database. What happened next would change the investigation forever. When the DNA profile was compared against evidence collected at the murder scenes years earlier, biological traces found on the victims, it was a match. After years of speculation, detectives finally had the predator's identity. The man who had eluded them by drifting across Britain's motorways was suddenly tethered by science, his invisibility shattered by a microscopic thread of genetic code. This moment marked a seismic shift in the case. For the families of Sammy-Jo and Tracey, it was bittersweet relief. There was anger that it had taken so long, but also vindication. Their daughters' lives mattered, and their killer would face justice. For police, the match was electrifying. After years of chasing theories, copycat Ripper, multiple offenders, even wild rumors of ritualistic killings, the mystery collapsed into one name. Alun Kyte. The press seized on the revelation. The Midlands Ripper was not an unknown phantom, but a lorry driver. A man people might have passed in service stations or seen sipping tea in roadside cafes. The ordinariness of Kyte was part of what made the story so chilling. If a man like that could commit such horrors without detection, how many others like him might still be out there? The DNA breakthrough gave police the confidence to build a case strong enough for trial. What had once been a wall of dead ends now became a clear path to justice. The hunt was effectively over. The pursuit was about to become a takedown. Once the DNA match identified Alun Kyte as the prime suspect, the investigation moved with renewed urgency. Detectives knew they were dealing with a must capable of extraordinary violence, and they could not risk giving him a chance to disappear again onto the endless stretches of Britain's motorways. Surveillance was set up around Kyte's movements. His truck routes were mapped, his known haunts monitored. What investigators saw only reinforced their determination. Kyte lived a life that gave him constant opportunity to prey on vulnerable women. Each delivery run, each stop in Birmingham or Nottingham, carried with it the potential for another tragedy. Time was no longer on the police's side. The arrest operation was planned with precision. Officers waited for Kyte to return home from a driving job, choosing the moment when he was off the road and away from potential victims. In the early morning light, police vans rolled quietly into his street. Neighbors later described the sudden appearance of armed officers, the sharp command of voices, and the sight of a man being led away in handcuffs who, to them, had seemed utterly ordinary. Inside his home, investigators searched for further evidence. The trial of Alun Kyte began in the year 2000 at Birmingham Crown Court, nearly half a decade after the murders of Sammy-Jo and Tracey Turner. For the families, it was a grim culmination of years spent waiting for answers. For the press, it was the unveiling of a man who had prowled the Midlands like a phantom. The prosecution built its case on forensic evidence, DNA traces taken from both victims that matched Kyte beyond any doubt. Scientists testified to the reliability of the profiles, explaining how the same genetic markers tied him to the crimes. In an era when DNA evidence was still relatively new, the clarity of the match carried enormous weight. The courtroom heard harrowing details of the women's final moments, how Kyte had lured them into his lorry, how they had been strangled and discarded in lonely places along the motorway network. Family members wept as the prosecution painted the picture of lives extinguished too soon. The defense, with little room to maneuver, attempted to cast doubt on the reliability of forensic methods and question procedural details in the collection of evidence. But the jury was not swayed. Adding to the damning portrait was Kyte's history of violence. The court heard about his previous assaults on sex workers, incidents that mirrored the brutality inflicted on Sammy-Jo and Tracey. This pattern of predation left no room for coincidence. In March 2000, the verdict was delivered, guilty on both counts of murder. Kyte was sentenced to life imprisonment, with the judge describing him as a ruthless predator who posed a continuing danger to women. The courtroom exhaled, a mixture of relief, sorrow, and anger that justice had taken so long. Outside, reporters declared the Midlands Ripper caged at last. Yet police quietly suggested that the story might not be over. They suspected Kyte could be linked to other unsolved murders along Britain's motorways, women whose names remained in cold case files. Justice had been served for two families, but the shadow of uncertainty stretched further still. With the life sentence handed down, Alun Kyte, forever branded the Midlands Ripper, faded into the prison system. For the families of Sammy-Jo and Tracey Turner, the verdict brought justice, but not peace. Two young women were gone, their lives erased in violent encounters that might have been prevented had society valued them more, had the investigations moved faster, had the warning signs been taken seriously. The case left scars on the Midlands. Communities that had once dismissed the dangers faced by sex workers were forced to confront an uncomfortable truth. Indifference can be deadly. Women who lived and worked on the margins were not faceless. Not disposable, they were daughters, sisters, mothers. Their loss was a reminder that predators like Kyte thrive in society's blind spots. Law enforcement, too, drew hard lessons. The role of DNA in finally catching Kyte highlighted both the promise and the delay of forensic science in the 1990s. It was a watershed moment, underscoring how technology could succeed where traditional methods had faltered. Yet even with Kyte behind bars, questions endure. Police have long suspected he may have killed more women, his lorry routes crossing paths with victims whose cases remain unsolved. Was Sammy-Jo and Tracey's tragedy only part of a larger tapestry of violence, still hidden in the shadows of Britain's motorways? The Midlands Ripper is locked away, but the mystery of his true toll may never be fully known.